So I've just gone through a good deal of information and still more to cover, but I think it's easier to understand just the general flow of the game if we just run through one complete game round. So let's do that. As you can see, we're at the starting setup of the game. We have 3 players, Tangus, Anazandra on the left-hand side, and Colette on the right-hand side. Now the player order is such that player 1 is Tangus, player 2 is Anna, and player 3 is Colette. However, the actual turn handling is going to be based on the unit section of the initiative table, then settlements, and then each player's war camp. Let's run through this and see how each turn is handled. First up on the initiative table, we move the current turn indicator to the first unit available. And that is always going to be the units with the lowest initiative score. In this case, we have just 3 units. One is each of the player's warlords. And the lowest initiative warlord in this case is going to be Anazandra, the sole judiciary. She goes first. During each unit's turn, they're going to be capable of moving and taking an action, as well as performing some other non-movement, non-action-based abilities. There is another form of ability called full turn, which requires expending both a movement and an action. Moving and taking an action can happen in either order. So in this case, we're going to take an action first and then move to a safer spot away from Tangus the Unchained. So player 2 has taken their turn. Their turn consisted of spending an action to deploy a wild unit in the forest terrain. Now, in the forest terrain, the Children of the Night, which was deployed, is one of the available wild units within that terrain type. The Children of the Night have a deployment cost of 10 gold, so Anna has spent 10 gold from her starting 100 gold war fund. The deployment costs for units are always going to be listed on their unit reference card and within the player guide. After deploying a wild unit, Anna moved 2 spaces to this forest terrain over here. Now that Anna has used up both her movement and action, her turn is complete and we can move the current turn indicator over to the next unit on the initiative table. Next up, it is Colette Ironheart Schneider's turn. Player 3 has decided to move Colette over to this snowland terrain and use an action to deploy a wild unit. In this case, it was the Boulder Hurler. She paid 22 gold from her war fund, and the Boulder Hurler can only be deployed on mountain terrain as it is a wild unit. Now, Colette is found on top of this forest terrain, but note that this forest terrain is enhanced with roads. So even though her movement effectively ended on Snowland, as a during turn ability, she took a free road movement onto the nearby unoccupied road space. And by doing so, she doesn't suffer any of the penalties that could be encountered while occupying Snowland terrain and gains the potential defensive benefits of occupying forest terrain. Now that Colette has finished her movement and action, her turn is complete and we move on to the next unit. Now the next unit on the initiative table is the Boulder Hurlers, followed by the Children of the Night, which were both just deployed. However, each unit is currently disabled, showing their red side up, their disabled side state. So their turns are effectively skipped, and we move over to Tangus the Unchained to take his turn as he is an enabled unit. Something to note is that sometimes units can be disabled again during gameplay. And another thing to note is that warlords will never be disabled, they'll always be enabled. The current turn indicator, or CTI for short, has now moved on to Tangus on the initiative table. Therefore, it was Tangus's turn. For Tangus's turn, the player 1 has moved Tangus over to this space here and also took an action to deploy a wild unit. And for forest terrain, there is a wild unit known as the Vermin Bombers, which costs 22 gold to deploy and has been set on the forest space as you see there. Now, just like with all other units, the vermin bombers start disabled, but something else to note is if you look at their unit reference card, which is beside the rest of player 1's assets, the unit reference card also happens to have 2 pieces of supply on their portrait. That's because the vermin bombers have a 2 supply maximum and starting supply amount. This is used for some of their unique unit abilities which require spending of supply. Once supply has been depleted, then those particular abilities can no longer be used. So because player 1 has moved Tangus and taken an action, there's nothing else available, and now we move on to the settlements section of the initiative table. So once all the units have completed their turn, the CTI moves over to the settlement section of the initiative table, and it gets placed right on top of the very first settlement at the very top, settlement 1 in this case, and that settlement proceeds to take its turn. Now, settlement 1 is not being protected, and it's not currently under assault, so there's nothing to do here, and we move on to settlement 2, which is the same thing, and so on and so forth. So because none of the settlements are currently under assault, and none of these settlements are under the protection of any other player, their turns are effectively skipped. Nothing really happens with those settlements. We just move down to the settlement events. First up would be the recover event. So during recover, if there was any settlements that had any damage on them, this is where they would repair some of that damage based on their recovery rate stat. Next is collect. So if there was any players that were protecting a particular settlement, this is where they would collect gold as payment for protecting that settlement. But because there are no protecting players, no one collects any gold. And the last one is grow. So during the grow event, each settlement is going to get 1 growth token. There is a condition here, unless the settlement is currently under assault. So if it has a war banner placed beside it, it cannot grow or gain any growth tokens. But in this case, none of the settlements are currently under assault, so they each gain 1 growth token, and the growth token is just the opposite side of the supply token. These settlements have completed their turns and the events have been handled. We move the CTI back up to the very top of the initiative table and over to the war camp section and place it right on top of the very first war camp on the top of the ID column. This case being player 1's war camp. It is now that player's turn to handle their war camp's actions. So for player 1's war camp, they're going to go an aggressive route against the war camp. So they're going to deploy a unit from their war camp, and whenever a unit gets deployed from a war camp, it's always within its borders. So it can either be on top of the war camp or within its borders. In this case, a level 1 war camp has a border size of 1, so up to 1 space away or on top. 12 gold was paid in order to get the freed slaves unit, which is a unit that's very useful for attacking settlements. And as with any new unit deployment from war camp or from wild terrain, 1 piece is going to be placed onto the initiative table, while the other piece is going to be placed anywhere within that war camp's borders. In this case, it's going to be just below the war camp, 1 space away, which also puts it in a space that occupies the settlement 1's borders. And in this case, both pieces, new unit deployment, it must be deployed disabled. Okay, after deploying a unit from player 1's war camp, they can choose to also attack or provision something. Provisioning is for any unit that is within their war camp's borders. In this case, there is a unit within the war camp's borders, but it's already fully healed and or at full supply, so there's nothing to do there, therefore nothing to provision. But attacking is an option. A war camp can attack any unit, settlement, or other war camp that is within its borders. In this case, player 1 doesn't want to attack its own unit, but they can attack Settlement 1. The way settlements and war camps can attack one another is their borders just have to overlap with the borders of the war camp. So Settlement 1, being a level 1 settlement, also has a border size of 1. So because the war camp, player 1's war camp borders are 1 space away, and Settlement 1's borders are also 1 space away, they can both attack each other. So player 1 is going to use their war camp's attack. It gets 4 attacks against the settlement, dealing 4 damage, which will be placed just beside Settlement 1. After damage has accumulated on Settlement 1 now enters the conditions of being under assault. Player 1 must then place their war banner, if one doesn't already exist, beside Settlement 1. This indicates to all players that Settlement 1 is currently under assault because there is at least 1 war banner beside it, which also prohibits Settlement 1 from gaining any more growth tokens until all of its associated war banners are removed. In addition, player 1 must now perform an alignment check for all units within their army after they place down their war banner. The effects of placing down a war banner grants each of player 1's chaos units 1 loyalty. Because Tengus deployed 2 chaos units, they both gain 1 loyalty each. If player 1 were to deploy a law unit, law units would lose 1 loyalty in the process because they do not favor assaulting of a settlement. They instead prefer to protect it. Player 1 has finished their war camp's turn. It is now player 2's war camp's turn to be handled. For player 2's war camp, they could choose to attack and assault Settlement 3, just like how player 1 war camp assaulted Settlement 1. But in this case, player 2 is going to opt not to attack and assault Settlement 3 for the next round, where they can declare protection of Settlement 3. Instead, player 2 is going to also deploy a unit from their war camp anywhere within their war camp's borders. In this case, they're going to pay 18 gold to deploy the Valkyrie, which is a unit that excels at taking out evil armored units like Tengus the Unchained. And just with the other unit deployment, the Valkyrie can start anywhere within the war camp borders or on top. In this case, the defensive cover available by the forest terrain is going to be a good spot to deploy the Valkyrie unit. And as with all units that get deployed, they start disabled. Next is player 3's war camp. For player 3, there are no units or overlapping borders within the borders of player 3's war camp. So there's nothing to attack, nothing to provision. So player 3 has the choice of converting their war camp and turning it into a caravan to utilize for next round, or deploying another unit. In this case, player 3 is going to deploy another unit, and they're going to get the Monastery Gargoyles unit for 24 gold. And for positioning, player 3 is going to want to position your Monastery Gargoyle as close to Settlement 2 as possible, because they're aiming to gain protection of both Settlement 2 and Settlement 4 in the subsequent round. With that deployment done, player 3's war camp's turn is finished. The CTI then moves downwards over to the war camp events, starting with repair, which is similar to repair for settlements. If there was any damage dice beside any of the war camps, this is where some of that built up and accumulated damage would get repaired and lowered based on the war camp's recovery rate stat. Right now, none of the war camps are damaged, so we move on to the next event, which is collect. All war camps are going to generate some degree of gold for each player. In this case, all war camps start at level 1, so all players are going to collect 5 gold generated by their war camps. As a war camp levels up, each player is going to collect more gold during this event in subsequent rounds. This completes the war camp section of the initiative table, so we move the CTI back up to the top of the unit recall section. There are no unit ID pieces here, so we're just going to move onwards to the end of round rules and events. The CTI proceeds downwards onto the first rule, which is move the dragon. So on the events track, the dragon takes its first step, which triggers a war speech. Starting with player 1, they get to choose between either gaining 1 loyalty for each of their units or 1 leadership for their warlord. In this case, player 1 is going to get 1 leadership for their warlord, which is placed right on top of their unit reference card's portrait. Player 2 gets poised with the same question, and for player 2, they are also going to opt for 1 leadership for their warlord. For player 3, they're instead going to choose to get 1 loyalty for each of their squad units. And that's the end of war speech, and we move the CTI over to concede. This is a check where each player, starting with player 1, is asked if they want to concede and lose the game. In this case, none of the players are conceded, so we move onwards to the next event, which is upkeep. During upkeep, this is where each player must pay gold relative to each of their non-warlord units' upkeep costs. Warlords do not have an upkeep cost and are unaffected by anything related to upkeep or upkeep-related rules. For each of the squad units that were just deployed this round, they're all disabled, and because they're disabled, their current upkeep turn gets skipped. So now we move on to the next rule, which is buying of loyalty. For buying loyalty, each player, starting with player 1, gets a chance to purchase loyalty for every one of their units within their army. The cost of purchasing loyalty for each of their units is double their listed upkeep costs. In this case, player 1 is going to opt, all 3 players are going to opt not to buy any loyalty for any of their units. Next rule is exchange leadership. This is a chance for each player and each warlord to gain leadership by leveraging the loyalty built up amongst their units. So for every 3 loyalty that's available within a player's army, they can pay that out and gain 1 leadership for their warlord. In this case, there are no players here that have enough loyalty to make this type of exchange, so we move onwards. Next is remove war banner. So this rule allows any player, starting with player 1, a chance to remove any war banners that are placed on the settlement section beside any given settlement. For each war banner that they remove, it costs 1 leadership to do so. If they are attempting to remove their own war banner, for example, Tangus has a war banner beside settlement 1 from previously assaulting it, in order to remove the player's own war banner, they must pay 3 leadership instead of the 1 normal cost. Next is end of this round effects. If there were any black tokens, which is the reverse side of the leadership token, placed on any units, this is where we would clean up each of those tokens and remove them, as those effects have now effectively ended this part of the round. Next rule is flip and enable. This is where all units on the battle map and on the initiative table will be flipped over such that their enabled side will be on display rather than their disabled side. If a unit is already enabled, they do not get flipped, they remain enabled. One caveat to that is that if there are any units that are being recalled by having their ID pieces on the recall, anywhere on the recall column, those units, both on the battle map and on the initiative table, remain disabled. They cannot be enabled. But for all other units, this is the moment where they get flipped over and enabled and ready to act in subsequent rounds. The final space on the initiative table is start new round. When the CTI proceeds onto this space, the current game round has effectively ended. The CTI then moves to the top left corner of the initiative table, labeled start, and we are now ready to start the second round of a game.